If you lived 100 years ago. Then and now. In the 1890s, life in America was changing fast. Every day, newspapers printed stories of new inventions. Skyscrapers of 20 stories rose above city skylines. Changes took place on farms, in towns, and in cities. This book tells you how people lived in New York City in the 1890s. If you lived in the 1890s, you wouldn't know about TV, computers, plastic, airplanes, movies with sound, or space travel. Just turning on a light switch was a new experience. You didn't hear the sounds today that you heard in the 1890s. Gas lamps hissing, horse hooves clopping, and the cracking of whips, clanging iron wheels, cries of pushcart vendors. You don't smell the smells of the 1890s. Horsey smells, leathery smells of carriages, or the smell of burning coal. Think about how you got to school today. In 1899, there were no school buses. Think about what you ate today. In the 1890s, there were no pizzas, potato chips, French fries, burritos, or frozen foods. Your life would be completely different. That time is often called the good old days, but it wasn't good for everyone. The rich were very rich, and the poor were very poor. In the 1890s, there weren't as many people in the middle class as there are today. Middle class people aren't rich or poor. They are in the middle. Millionaires made up only a small part of the population, but they had more money than all other New Yorkers put together. Who lived in New York City? Today, there are about 8 million people living in New York City. In 1900, there were about 3.5 million. Over 1.5 million people were poor and lived in the slums, almost half the population. Some New Yorkers had ancestors who came from Holland, England, or France. More than half the teenagers living in New York had a parent who wasn't born in America. New people were arriving every day. From across the seas came waves of new immigrants: Irish, Germans, Italians, Scandinavians, and Jews from Europe. From the South came blacks who wanted to have a better life. Some had been slaves. From the country came young people who were tired of the hard work of farm life. Then and now. In the 1890s, life in America was changing fast. Every day, newspapers printed stories of new inventions. Skyscrapers of 20 stories rose above city skylines. Changes took place on farms, in towns, and in cities. This book tells you how people lived in New York City in the 1890s. If you lived in the 1890s, you wouldn't know about TV, computers, plastic, airplanes. Where did poor people movies live? With sound, or some poor people lived in shacks. Just turning on a light switch found in the street experience. But most lived in people in tenements kept tenements shut around boarding houses, so they wouldn't breathe. As many as 2,005 melty clotted lived in one sticking tenement buildings. But in the summertime, most tenements had doors for any breeze they could get. Each floor had some warm no windows at all. 2 or 3 sources so thin that you could hear the cries. They did not have fresh air next to the smell of burning coal. Tenement apartments were small and cockroaches crawled on the cracked. Some families had lots of beds and cots for relatives who had just arrived in America, where there might hardly be any light. Continued on next page. Machines that the family needed to make a living: cigar rolling machines, sewing machines, or tools for making paper flowers. The poorest unmarried men lived in shabby buildings called flop houses. It cost a man 25 cents a night for a cot to sleep on, a locker, and a screen to separate him from the man next to him. Just the cot would be 15 cents. It cost 10 cents to sleep on the floor. Boarding houses were sometimes better than tenements, and certainly better than flop houses. A room in a simple boarding house was $2 a week, plus $3 extra for meals. Fancier boarding houses charged $10 a week for a room. People in the boarding houses ate their meals together. A single woman would feel comfortable in a boarding house. Middle-class people lived in apartment buildings, some with elevators, that were better kept than tenements. The very rich lived in grand mansions with huge private ballrooms. One house might take up a whole city block. Rich families were the first to have telephones. The first New York City telephone directory was 2 pages, with 271 telephone numbers listed. A few years later, in 1880, the directory listed 2,800 names. Rich people had the newest appliances: gas stoves, toasters, even washing machines. Many had several kitchens and servants to work in them. The rich had another new invention: toilet paper. 500 sheets sold for 50 cents. Everyone else used newspapers cut into squares.